mist clings to the turrets of Glamis castle like a suffocating shroud that refuses to lift even under the midday sun. Located in the majestic valley of Strathmore in Angus, Scotland, this fortress stands as a testament to medieval architecture and ancient secrets that have refused to die. The red sandstone walls seem to absorb the fading light of the sun, leaving the structure in a perpetual state of gloom. Once twilight descends upon the valley, it is said that the stones themselves hold memories of betrayal and bloodshed that have seeped into the mortar over centuries of noble conflict. Visitors often report an inexplicable chill that penetrates even the thickest winter coats, a sensation that suggests they are being watched by unseen eyes from the arrow slits above. This is not merely a home for the living, but a prison for the restless dead who walk the corridors. The history of Glamis Castle is woven into the very fabric of Scottish royalty, and the bloody struggles for power that defined the 16th century. It is a place where legends are not merely stories told to frighten children, but are accepted as historical fact by those who live within its shadow. The castle has been the ancestral home of the Earls of Strathmore and Kinghorn for hundreds of years, and was the childhood home of Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, the Queen Mother. Yet beneath the veneer of royal splendor and architectural grandeur lies a darkness that stems from a specific tragedy. It is a tragedy born of a king's paranoia and a woman's suffering. The atmosphere within the castle walls is heavy with the weight of this past injustice. To understand the haunting one must first understand the intense political climate of Scotland. During the reign of King James V, the king was a man consumed by a deep-seated hatred for the Douglas clan, a powerful family that had once held control over him during his youth. This animosity was not a mere dislike, but a burning vendetta that clouded his judgment and dictated his actions. He sought to systematically destroy every member of the Douglas family, regardless of their innocence or distance from political intrigue. Janet Douglas, the Lady of Glamis, was a prominent member of this despised family. Her only crime was her lineage and her relation to the Earl of Angus, the man the king loathed above all others. Janet Douglas was known throughout the land for her beauty and her kindness, a woman of grace who commanded respect from all who knew her. She lived a relatively quiet life at Glamis Castle, dedicated to her husband and her children, trying to navigate the treacherous waters of Scottish nobility. However, her happiness was a constant affront to King James V, who saw her existence as a reminder of the power the Douglas clan still held. The king watched her from afar, his spies reporting on her movements and her associations, waiting for the slightest slip that could be used against her. The tension in the air was palpable, as the Lady of Glamis lived under the constant threat of royal wrath. first strike against Janet came when her husband John Lyon, the sixth Lord Glamis, passed away, leaving her a widow with a young son, vulnerable, and without the protection of a husband. Janet became an easier target for the machinations of the king. King James V seized this opportunity to tighten the noose around her neck. He accused her of treason and of communicating with her exiled brothers, who were enemies of the crown. These accusations were baseless, fabricated by a mind poisoned with vengeance. But in the eyes of the law, the king's word was absolute. Janet found herself fighting for her life and the safety of her son against a monarch who held all the power. Despite the lack of evidence, the king continued to pursue her with a relentless fury that shocked the court. He confiscated her lands and properties, leaving her destitute and desperate. Yet Janet remained strong, her spirit unbroken by the relentless assault on her character and her livelihood. She married her second husband, Archibald Campbell of Skipness, hoping to find some measure of safety in a new alliance. But the king's hatred was not so easily thwarted. He saw her resilience not as a virtue, but as an act of defiance that needed to be crushed completely. The shadows around Glamis castle seemed to lengthen as the inevitable confrontation drew nearer. The final blow was struck in the year 1537, when King James V leveled a new and far more sinister accusation against Janet Douglas. He claimed that she had attempted to poison him and that she was practicing witchcraft to bring about his death. In the superstitious climate of the 16th century, such charges were a death sentence. The accusation of witchcraft was a convenient tool used to eliminate political enemies, as it required little proof and incited fear in the populace. Soldiers arrived at Glamis castle under the cover of darkness, tearing Janet away from her family and dragging her into custody. The screams of her children echoed through the stone halls, marking the beginning of the end. Janet was not the only one to suffer for the king's vendetta. Her husband Archibald Campbell and her young son John Lyon were also arrested and thrown into the dark, damp dungeons of Edinburgh Castle. The king was determined to extract a confession by any means necessary. The conditions in the dungeon were horrific, with rats skittering across the wet stone floors and the smell of decay permeating the air. Janet was kept in isolation, separated from her loved ones, unaware of their fate. The psychological torture of not knowing whether her son was alive or dead was far worse than any physical pain they could inflict upon her. To secure a conviction, King James V resorted to the most brutal methods imaginable. He ordered the torture of Janet's servants and family members, forcing them to provide false testimony against her. Her young son, barely a teenager, was forced to watch as his loyal servants were stretched on the rack, their limbs pulled until they snapped. The boy, terrified and traumatized, was then threatened with the same fate if he did not testify against his own mother. Under extreme duress and fear for his life, the young Lord Glamis eventually broke down and signed the confession the king demanded. It was a betrayal born of horror, a lie that would seal his mother's doom. The trial of Janet Douglas was a sham, a theatrical display of justice that was rigged from the very beginning. She stood before her accusers in Edinburgh, a lone woman against the might of the crown. Despite her eloquent defense and the obvious lack of credible evidence, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. The judges, fearful of the king's wrath, found her guilty of witchcraft and treason. The sentence was passed with a cold finality that sent a shiver through the courtroom. Janet Douglas, the Lady of Glamis, was condemned to be burned at the stake on Castle Hill. The announcement was met with gasps of horror from the public, who widely believed in her innocence. The day of the execution was a grim affair, the sky hanging low and grey over the city of Edinburgh. Crowds gathered at Castle Hill, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound sorrow. Janet was led out of the castle, dungeons her head, held high despite the chains that bound her wrists. She wore a simple dress, stripped of her noble finery, yet she possessed a regal dignity that silenced the jeering mob. As she walked toward the pyre, she looked out at the faces of the people, her eyes filled with a sadness that transcended fear. She maintained her innocence to the very end, refusing to beg for mercy from a king who possessed none. The executioner tied her to the wooden stake, the rough ropes digging into her flesh. Bundles of dry wood and kindling were piled high around her feet, awaiting the spark that would consume her. A hushed silence fell over the crowd as the torch was brought forward. The flames caught, quickly fed by oil and pitch, rising up to engulf the woman who had become a symbol of royal tyranny. Janet did not scream in those final moments, but instead prayed silently, her lips moving in a final plea for her soul. The heat was intense, distorting the air around the pyre. As the smoke billowed up into the leaden sky, carrying the spirit of the Lady of Glamis away from the world of men. While her body was reduced to ash, her spirit refused to depart from the mortal coil. The injustice of her death had been so great, the agony of her final moments so profound, that it tethered her soul to the place she had loved most in life. Almost immediately after her execution, reports began to surface of strange occurrences within the walls of Glamis castle. Servants whispered of a gray mist that moved through the corridors with a purpose, assuming the shape of a woman in a long flowing dress. The air in certain rooms would turn freezing cold in an instant, causing candles to flicker and die without a draft. The Grey Lady had returned home. The haunting is most concentrated in the family chapel, a small and intimate space within the castle where the family would gather for prayer. It is said that Janet Douglas frequented this chapel in life, seeking solace from the troubles that plagued her. In death, she continues to visit this sanctuary, kneeling before the altar in eternal supplication. Witnesses have described seeing a translucent figure draped in gray robes, her head bowed in prayer. When approached, she does not acknowledge the living, but simply fades away into the stone walls, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of sadness and a lingering scent of smoke. There is a specific seat in the chapel, located in the back corner, that is reserved exclusively for the Gray Lady. For centuries, no member of the family or visitor has been allowed to sit in this chair. It is a small wooden seat, unremarkable in appearance, yet it radiates a palpable energy that warns people away. Legend says that anyone who dares to sit in the Gray Lady's chair will incur her wrath and suffer a terrible misfortune. The seat remains empty during services, a silent testament to the enduring presence of the executed noblewoman. Even the family dogs refuse to go near that corner of the chapel, often growling at the empty air. One of the most chilling accounts of the Gray Lady occurred in the late 19th century during a renovation of the castle. Workmen were busy repairing the stonework in the clock tower when they heard a soft, weeping sound coming from the room above. Assuming someone was injured, they rushed up the narrow spiral staircase, only to find the room completely empty. The weeping continued, growing louder and more desperate, echoing off the cold stone walls. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and a gray mist materialized in the center of the room, forming the outline of a woman in distress. The workmen fled in terror, refusing to return to the tower until a priest had blessed the area. The apparitions are not limited to the chapel or the clock tower. Guests staying in the guest bedrooms have reported waking up in the middle of the night to find a woman standing at the foot of their bed. She appears solid at first, her features obscured by the gloom. But as their eyes adjust, she becomes transparent, her sad eyes fixed upon them. She never speaks, but her presence conveys a deep sense of warning, as if she is trying to protect them from the other darker entities that are said to inhabit Glamis. Some have even claimed to feel a cold hand brushing against their forehead, a spectral caress that chills the blood. The Queen Mother, who spent her childhood at Glamis Castle, was well aware of the family ghosts, although she rarely spoke of them publicly. It is known that the Bose-Lyon family accepted the supernatural as a part of their daily lives. There are stories of young Elizabeth and her brother David playing hide and seek in the long corridors and encountering the Gray Lady. Instead of being frightened, the children reportedly viewed her as a benign presence, a sad guardian who watched over the house. However, not all encounters were so peaceful, and the family learned to respect the boundaries between the living and the dead. During the Second World War, the castle was used as a convalescent home for wounded soldiers. Many of these men hardened by the horrors of war, found themselves unnerved by the atmosphere at Glamis. Nurses reported seeing the figure of a woman gliding through the wards at night, pausing to look at the sleeping soldiers. One soldier claimed that he saw the gray lady standing by the window, staring out at the dark landscape with a look of infinite longing. When he asked who she was, she turned to him and smiled sadly before vanishing into thin air. The encounter left him shaken, convinced that he had seen a soul trapped in purgatory. The clock tower remains a focal point for the haunting activity. The rhythmic ticking of the great clock is often accompanied by the sound of phantom footsteps pacing back and forth on the floorboards above. These footsteps are heavy and deliberate sounding, like someone anxious or waiting for news that will never come. It is believed that this was where Janet Douglas spent many hours worrying about the fate of her husband and waiting for the king's soldiers to arrive. The sound of her pacing has been etched into the atmosphere, repeating endlessly like a broken record of anxiety and dread. Another disturbing phenomenon associated with the Gray Lady is the sound of hammering that is sometimes heard in the dead of night. This rhythmic pounding is said to resemble the sound of workmen constructing a wooden scaffold or pyre. It echoes from the courtyard beneath the clock tower, reverberating through the stone walls of the castle. Those who hear it are filled with an instinctive dread, knowing that it represents the preparations for Janet's brutal execution. The sound is a sonic imprint of the tragedy, a ghostly reenactment of the moments leading up to her death. Skeptics have tried to dismiss the stories of the Gray Lady as mere folklore or the product of overactive imaginations. They argue that old castles are naturally drafty and noisy places, prone to creating optical illusions. However, the sheer number of consistent reports from reliable witnesses over hundreds of years makes it difficult to dismiss the phenomenon entirely. The descriptions of the apparition are remarkably consistent across centuries, describing the same gray dress, the same sad features, and the same location in the chapel. There is a weight of evidence that suggests something truly unexplainable is happening at Glamis. The psychological impact of the haunting on the residents of Glamis cannot be overstated. Living in a house where the past is so tangibly present creates a unique kind of stress. Every shadow could be a ghost, every creak of the floorboards a spectral footstep. The Earls of Strathmore have had to learn to coexist with their ancestors' spirits, treating them with a mixture of reverence and caution. The Gray Lady is considered a member of the family, albeit one who has been dead for nearly 500 years. Her presence is a constant reminder of the family's turbulent history. Interestingly, the Gray Lady is not the only ghost said to haunt Glamis Castle. Although she is the most famous, the castle is also home to the legend of Earl Beardy, a nobleman who allegedly played cards with the devil himself and lost his soul. There is also the mystery of the monster of Glamis, a deformed child who was supposedly walled up alive in a secret room. These darker legends intertwine with the tragic story of Janet Douglas, creating a complex tapestry of supernatural lore. However, while Earl Beardy represents vice and the monster represents shame, the Grey Lady represents pure injustice. Photographers and paranormal investigators have flocked to Glamis Castle over the years, hoping to capture evidence of the Grey Lady. There have been numerous photographs taken in the chapel that show strange anomalies, orbs of light and mist-like shapes. While none of these can be definitively proven to be the spirit of Janet Douglas, they add to the mystique of the location. Electronic voice phenomena recordings have also captured whispers and sighs in the empty chapel, suggesting that there is indeed an intelligence present that is trying to communicate. The legend of the Grey Lady serves as a grim reminder of the absolute power of the monarchy in medieval Scotland. It illustrates how easily a life could be destroyed by the whims of a king, and how justice was often a farce. Janet's story is not just a ghost story, but a historical tragedy, a cautionary tale about unchecked power and vengeance. Her spirit lingers not to scare the living, but perhaps to ensure that her story is never forgotten. She is a witness to history, trapped in the moment of her greatest suffering. As the sun sets over the Angus countryside, the red walls of Glamis Castle turn a deep blood red. The tourists leave, and the heavy oak doors are bolted shut for the night. Inside, the silence is heavy and profound, broken only by the settling of the ancient structure. In the chapel, the shadows lengthen and the air grows cold. The empty chair in the corner waits for its occupant. It is in these quiet hours that the boundary between the past and the present is thinnest. If one were to stand outside the chapel door at midnight, they might hear the soft rustle of fabric against stone. They might feel a sudden drop in temperature that makes their breath mist in the air. And if they were brave enough to peer through the keyhole, they might see a faint gray glow illuminating the darkness. It is the Grey Lady kneeling in eternal prayer, seeking the peace that was denied to her in life. She is the guardian of Glamis, the tragic queen of shadows, whose love for her family bound her to this earth forever. The story of Janet Douglas ends in fire, but her legacy endures in the cold stone of Glamis. She is a permanent resident of the castle, as much a part of the estate as the tapestries and the armor. Her presence is a thread that connects the modern world to the brutal days of the 16th century. As long as Glamis Castle stands, the Grey Lady will continue her vigil, a silent specter haunting the halls of her ancestral home. The flames that consumed her body could not destroy her spirit, which remains strong and defiant to this day. So if you ever find yourself walking the corridors of Glamis Castle, and you feel a sudden chill or catch a glimpse of a gray figure in your peripheral vision, do not be alarmed. It is likely just Janet Douglas making her rounds, checking on the home she was torn from so violently. Pay her your respects and move on, for she means you no harm. But whatever you do, never sit in the empty chair in the chapel, for some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, and the wrath of the Grey Lady is a force best left undisturbed.